So here is an anecdote I have always liked. It is probably an apocryphal story, but I will tell it anyway. It is the 1980s and President Ronald Reagan is making a state visit to Canada. And as he gets off the plane, he shakes hands with Governor General Jean Sauvé. And one of the American news reporters who is covering the event turns to his cameraman and says, "For God's sakes, turn off your camera." And the cameraman says, "What?" And the reporter says, "Turn off your camera right now." And the cameraman says, "Why?" And the reporter says, "Because if you film her, we will have to explain who she is." In theory, a governor general is somebody who runs a general government. That's right, the title has nothing to do with a military general, but rather comes from the French practice of having the adjective come after the noun, sort of like with an attorney general or a surgeon general. I recently learned this from my good pal Knowing Better. But anyway, during the age of imperialism, the great powers would appoint both governors regional and governors general, with the governor general being the top guy who oversaw the whole colonial project in its entirety. So the French, for example, appointed a governor general to oversee the big region known as French Indochina. Holland appointed a governor general to oversee the Dutch East Indies. And the Spanish, and then Americans, appointed a governor general to administer the Philippine Islands. If you've studied World War II, you will know that even the Nazis appointed a governor general to oversee much of Poland after conquering it. But the sort of governor generals that we will be talking about today are the ones that originated in the British Empire. Specifically, the governor generals that the Brits appointed to oversee three of their largest and most complex colonial zones: Southern Africa, Australasia, and British North America, later renamed Canada. So here is a quick history of British colonial democracy. When a colony had a white population that was deemed large and sophisticated enough to be trusted with some degree of decision-making power, a regional governor could appoint an executive council of local citizens to assist him. And then, when things were really starting to go well, the governor could also create a legislative council of elected representatives to help with the government as well. Oh boy. And then, at some point, someone was like, "Hey, what if the governor appointed members of the executive council from the legislative council?" And once that happened, you basically had a crude form of parliamentary democracy in the colonies, in which every important political person, except for the governor, was elected in some form. All right, and then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British united their networks of colonies in Canada, Australia, and South Africa into giant mega colonies that were sort of based on the United States. The regional governments became provinces or states, and the general government, headed by the governor general at the top of the colonial pyramid, became a democratically run national or federal government. And the federal government would feature a new federal parliament, and the governor general would appoint members of that parliament to his executive council, which became known as the federal cabinet. All right, is this all making sense so far? The head of the governor general's executive council became known as the prime minister. And in short order, the power of the prime minister made the governor general an increasingly unimportant figure in the political system. Once a colony became fully self-governing, the British didn't really need to work through a governor anymore. They could just boss around the prime minister directly, if it came to that. Accordingly, in time, the office of Governor General became little more than a patronage position, where the Brits could stick like a cousin of the king or some British politician or a British military guy to reward them for their service or even pad their resume. Here's a quote from the Scottish author Goldwin Smith, describing the nature of the Governor General of Canada in 1891. "The practical aim of a Governor General is social popularity combined with political peace. So long as he simply gives way in everything to the politicians, he will have a quiet course, and at the end of it, he will go away amidst general plaudits with the reputation of having governed Canada well. He is then qualified in the eyes of the home government for a higher post." And this got so tacky that soon the Brits stopped appointing governor generals to their white dominions at all. They instead allowed the governments of those places to pick one of their own people for the job. The first of these being an Australian judge with the wonderful name of Isaac Isaacs. He became the first non-British person to be appointed Governor General of a British colony in 1931. And this outsourcing of responsibility for appointing the Governor Generals became one of the final colonial cords that Britain cut with these places, which were by now functioning as pretty much completely independent countries. But what about the rest of the empire? Well, there was a time when the British thought that they could export the Canadian, Australian, South African model of gradual democracy to some of their other colonies as well. But the British were also much more cautious and condescending about introducing self-rule into the non-white parts of their empire. And as a result, it took them a very long time to even get around to introducing phase 1 of this whole system. And by the time they did, it was like the mid-20th century, and the locals were not terribly interested in playing along. In colonies like India and the Gold Coast, the nationalist elites of those places demanded complete independence as soon as possible, not stage-managed Canadian-style democracy under some indefinite period of British supervision. And so the traditional narrative is that the Brits ultimately had no choice except to bow to the pressure and just abruptly abandoned all of their colonies beginning in the late 1940s. And the independence leaders, for their part, agreed to adopt some pretty slapped-together interim constitutions based on the British colonial government system rather than delay independence any further. In 1947, India and Pakistan became the first non-white British colonies to gain independence, followed in 1957 by the Gold Coast, now known as Ghana. Now, during the colonial times, India-Pakistan did not have a governor general. The head of their colonial government was known as a viceroy, and the Gold Coast just had a plain governor. But after independence, both of these men had their official job title changed to Governor General. And this was important because it signaled a fundamental change in the understanding of what a Governor General was. From henceforth, under the English system of government, a Governor General was no longer a colonial administrator of a large general government, but rather a purely figurehead position in an independent country. And this pattern repeated in pretty much every country that the British granted independence to in the 20th century. Upon independence, the top-ranking British colonial person became a Governor General, and shortly thereafter he resigned and was replaced by a native-born Governor General. And what usually happened after that was that the title of the Governor General was then changed to President, which was seen as more appropriate for an independent country, or the position was just abolished as a pointless relic of British rule. Okay, so that brings us to today. Today, there are 15 countries in this world that still have a Governor General, and they are the original white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, and the Australian offshoot New Zealand, 3 Pacific nations around Australia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu, the Central American nation of Belize, and 8 countries in the former British Caribbean. Broadly speaking, the countries that use the Governor General system today are ones that had a relatively peaceful transition from British colonial rule. They also tend to be places where there is some high degree of affinity for British traditions and culture and customs. In some cases, it may also just represent a kind of post-independence political expediency that no one was ever able to come up with a better alternative to. A few countries, like Sierra Leone and Sri Lanka, stuck with the Governor General system for quite a while, not because they had any great affinity for it, but because they just couldn't come up with a better replacement system. All right, so enough history. Let us talk about the Governor Generals of today. Well, in most cases, they all work more or less the same. In fact, when you read the constitutions of the 15 Governor General countries, it seems pretty clear that a lot of them just copy and pasted their sections of what the Governor General does. Of the 15 countries, only 2 of them elect the Governor General, the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, where the position is chosen by Parliament. In every other country, their constitution just says that their Governor General shall be appointed by Her Majesty and shall hold office during Her Majesty's pleasure, which in practice means that the Governor General is just appointed by the Prime Minister of the country. Since Her Majesty, in this case Queen Elizabeth, does not do anything unless the Prime Minister tells her to, though this is itself still controversial because it means that even in these 15 independent countries, the British monarch still technically holds some power over them. But anyway, what sort of person gets hired by a prime minister to be a governor general? Well, at one time, they were often retired politicians, but that became controversial, so these days they are often accomplished people from some non-political, non-controversial profession. The current Governor General of New Zealand, for instance, is a woman with a background in the glamorous world of corporate governance reform. The Governor General of Barbados is a former ambassador and judge, which I think is more typical. The Governor Generals of Jamaica and the Solomon Islands are both retired clergymen, which I guess is not seen as very controversial in those very religious countries. And the Governor General of Canada is a former astronaut. She has been making the news a fair bit recently because she is apparently a very cruel boss who subjects her staff to humiliating pop quizzes about the names of all the planets. This business about the Governor Generals holding office at Her Majesty's pleasure also means that Governor Generals basically get to hang around for as long as they want. The Solomon Islands is the only country where they have strict term limits. Everywhere else they just generally serve for about 5 or 6 years and then retire when they're ready. Sometimes they do get pretty comfy though. The recent Governor General of St. Lucia, Dame Perlouette Louisi, served for an incredible 20 years from 1997 to 2017. And why might they want to hang around for that long? Well, being Governor General seems like a pretty cushy job most of the time. You get to live in a big colonial mansion and basically just do ceremonial stuff. Officially, the Governor General is still mandated to represent the Queen, which means do the kind of ceremonial things that she might do if she was around, like visit schools and hospitals and give speeches at the dedication of new war memorials and that sort of thing. In Caribbean countries, I've noticed a lot of the female governor generals even put a lot of effort into dressing like the Queen, with big hats and brightly colored suits. Governor generals are also supposed to do all of these ceremonial duties that international diplomatic protocol dictates must be done by the head of state, like open the Olympics or greet foreign dignitaries at the airport. This has led to some debate as to whether a governor general actually is the head of state of their country, or if they are just someone who acts as the head of state on behalf of Queen Elizabeth, the true head of state. This is a very thrilling discussion, as you might imagine. Now, the governor generals do have some political powers, but they are very restricted. About 99% of what they are allowed to do can only be done on the explicit instruction of the prime minister or his cabinet. So, for example, a governor general signs bills into law, but only the bills that the prime minister has told her to sign. This passage from the Constitution of Belize is pretty typical. In the exercise of his functions, the governor general shall act in accordance with the advice of the cabinet or a minister, except in cases where he is required by this constitution or any other law to act in accordance with his own deliberative judgment. And just what are those cases where he is required to act in accordance with his own deliberative judgment, you ask? Well, the constitutions generally say that a governor general is allowed to use some degree of discretion in the following two scenarios: appointing a prime minister after a parliamentary election and deciding whether or not a parliamentary election should be held. So we can look to the Constitution of the Bahamas for a pretty standard description of who a governor general is supposed to appoint as prime minister. The leader of the party which commands the support of the majority of the members of parliament. Or, if no one party controls a majority, the member of parliament who is, in his judgment, most likely to command the support of the majority of members of that house. In other words, the governor general should just ratify the basic logic of the parliamentary system, which says that the prime minister should be the guy that leads the largest faction of parliament. In a place like Canada, this might mean just one party, or in a place like New Zealand, it might mean an alliance of multiple parties. Although, even in a country like New Zealand, it is not like the Governor General is coming up with an alliance of parties all by herself. The parties get together on their own, and she just rubber stamps their coalition. I believe this is how it works in many European countries that have kings or queens as well. The Governor General's second discretionary power involves the timing of elections. As we learned from my award-winning video on impeachments of the world, in most parliamentary countries, the parliament can vote no confidence in a prime minister that they feel has failed at his job. In governor-general countries, it is usually then stated that the prime minister must either resign or hold an emergency election, because the logic is he has been discredited from continuing to govern any further. But in most of these constitutions, they also say that the Governor General can refuse to hold an election if, in his opinion, there is some other figure in the parliament who is capable of running the country. The logic is that if there is a faction of the parliament that is powerful enough to vote out the prime minister, maybe the head of that faction should be given a shot at being prime minister without an election. Different countries have different attitudes about how democratically legitimate this is, but I don't really believe it has happened much in the modern era in any country, with one big exception. In 1975, the Governor General of Australia, a guy named John Kerr, believed that Prime Minister Gough Whitlam had lost the support of Parliament because he kept losing votes there, even though there was never a formal vote of no confidence in him. So Governor General Kerr abruptly fired Whitlam and appointed the head of the parliamentary opposition, a guy named Malcolm Fraser, to be Prime Minister instead. To this day, this is still one of the most controversial episodes of modern Australian politics, and something that Australian political nerds love to talk your ear off about. It also led to this famous clip where Prime Minister Whitlam talks to reporters after learning he is going to be replaced.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
This episode gets to one of the big issues with Governor Generals, which is the degree that anyone really trusts them to use their discretion over anything of importance. Since Governor Generals are not elected in most countries, there is a sense that they are not really accountable to anyone for the decisions that they make. Governor Generals, in fact, often carry themselves in this explicitly aloof, sort of kingly way, rarely giving interviews or press conferences or anything like that. In theory, this is supposed to help keep them politically neutral and make their decisions seem uncontroversial, but it can also make them come off as very secretive and arrogant. It's kind of similar to how a lot of people feel about Supreme Court judges these days. So the response argument then becomes, well, I guess the Governor General should just do nothing then. Since he's not elected, but the Prime Minister is, he should just rubber stamp anything the Prime Minister wants. But then that just begs the question of why we bother to keep this position at all. As I said earlier, many countries around the world have in fact explicitly abolished the Governor General's position, seeing it as a pointless colonial relic. Malta, Trinidad and Tobago, and Mauritius were the last three countries to do so. They replaced their Governor Generals with a figurehead president, who has many of the same powers as the Governor General, but is now elected by the Parliament and is thus seen as having more democratic legitimacy. Australia had a referendum on abolishing the Governor General's position in 1999, partially in response to the events of 1975, but it failed. A few countries abolished their office of Governor General under more controversial circumstances, such as the apartheid government of South Africa in 1960, or the nation of Fiji in 1987, following a military coup. And speaking of military coups, that is another controversial thing about Governor Generals. The Canadian political scientist Frank McKinnon once famously called the office of Governor General a constitutional fire extinguisher. The idea being that if a prime minister ever got completely out of line and started setting fire to the Constitution, metaphorically speaking, the Governor General would be democracy's last line of defense. He could step in and fire him or veto his bad decisions and things like that. The problem is there is not really a lot of evidence to suggest that Governor Generals are powerful enough to stamp out tyranny when it starts to emerge. The classic example is the nation of Grenada, which saw a Marxist politician named Maurice Bishop stage a bloodless coup in 1979 and proclaim himself prime minister. Bishop was then overthrown and killed in a 1983 counter coup led by an even more extreme gang of Marxists. This development then triggered an American invasion of the country.
Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing or landings on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean to assist in the restoration of conditions of law and order and of governmental institutions to the island of Grenada, where a brutal group of leftist thugs violently seized power
And the fire of political chaos was eventually extinguished in Grenada, but the country's Governor General didn't have much to do with it. The Governor General of Grenada, throughout all of this, a guy named Sir Paul Scoon, was officially in favor of the US invasion of his country, but I don't think that was really the key variable in why it happened. I mean, we can compare Grenada to Fiji, which did not get a US invasion after its coup in 1987. The Governor General there was just a hapless bystander, and democracy died in Fiji, despite his formal objection. So what do you think about Governor Generals? Is it a position worth keeping, or nah? I'd be particularly keen to hear from anyone who lives in a country with a Governor General from outside of the traditional Canada, Australian, Kiwi axis. If you are from the Caribbean, or Belize, or Papua New Guinea, what do you think most people think of the position? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you all next week.